At OpenClass, our mission is to improve and democratize education. We're constantly trying to push the envelope of what a personalized education should look like, and today we're so excited to announce the launch of review flows, which allow instructors to deeply customize the delivery of questions based on student performance of learning objectives within an assignment. Let's take a step back. The single biggest problem that OpenClass aims to solve is the one-size-fits-all problem, where one instructor cannot feasibly reach the unique needs of sometimes hundreds of students in their class. Very quickly, you have lost students trying to learn new information that builds upon previous information that they are already struggling with. It's impossible. As some specific examples, in an English as a second language class, you may have students trying to form sentences before they understand how adjectives are used in English. In a calculus class, you may have students trying to determine if functions are differentiable before they understand derivatives. Or in an intro to programming class, you may have students trying to write loops before they understand array bounds. The point is that most classes include hierarchical learning objectives, where one concept builds upon another concept. And until now, the solution was kind of, hey, if you don't understand something, try to figure it out in your own time because the class is moving on with or without you. And here's where OpenClass review flows come into play. Now in OpenClass, instructors can define specific learning objectives for each assignment and define relationships between learning objectives. For instance, you could have learning objective A precedes learning objective B. That means that a learner must demonstrate mastery of questions from learning objective A before moving on to questions from learning objective B. Our in-house artificial intelligence will adjust the pace of the assignment based on the learner's performance. For instance, a learner that quickly demonstrates mastery of learning objective A will quickly move on to learning objective B, and a learner that struggles with learning objective A will be brought through the material more slowly. Let's walk through an example. Here's a sample assignment on loops in Python. A learner will struggle to understand loops if they don't already understand what lists are and how to access specific elements from lists, and thus questions on both of these concepts are also included in this assignment. Now let's break this assignment up into different learning objectives using this Add Learning Objective button from the assignment builder. This assignment includes multiple types of questions, including list concepts, which we can drag in front of the list concepts questions, list indices, which we can move in front of the list indices questions, which is right here. There are some questions that walk through an example of a loop, so walking through loop example. And we can bring this over those questions. So basically these questions are, what is the element at index 0 of this list? What is the element at index 1 of the same list? What is the element at index 2 of the same list, and so on. And lastly, we have questions which have students write loops, so writing loops. And let's move this in front of those questions. And now our assignment is broken up into these different learning objectives, but now let's go one step further and define relationships between these learning objectives, because it's probably a bad idea to start the assignment off asking students to write loops before they understand what lists are and how to access different elements from a list. So basically to do that from each of these learning objectives, you can click this little gear icon and we could set list concepts has no relationship to list indices. That's true. We could ask both of these or questions from both of these learning objectives at the same time, but we do want list concepts, these questions to come before that walking through a loop example. And we also want it to come before that the writing loops, which should come at the end. Now let's go to list indices, which basically the same thing. We want list indices to have no relationship to list concepts, meaning at the beginning of the assignment, let's ask questions from both of these learning objectives, both list indices and list concepts, without prioritizing the mastery of one before the mastery of the other. But we do want to make sure that the learner has mastered both of these learning objectives before moving on to that example and before having them write their own loops. Now, when we go into this walking through a loop example, we'll notice that it already is set to follow list concepts and list indices, since we already set those from the previous learning objectives. But we also want this to precede the writing loops learning objective, which basically means this assignment will follow the format where questions from list concepts and list indices will be drawn first. Once the learner masters both of those learning objectives, they'll move on to questions from this walking through a loop example. And after they master this learning objective, they'll move on to questions from the writing loops learning objective. And if we go to this writing loops learning objective, we'll notice that everything is already set correctly. It's going to follow the previous 3 learning objectives, which is good. That means that these writing loops questions will be asked at the very end of the assignment, once the learner has already reviewed all of the other learning objectives that are critical for understanding this learning objective. And the other thing that you'll notice from each learning objective is you can also set a delivery style. Basically, the delivery style can either be adaptive or sequential. Basically, an adaptive delivery style means that OpenClass is going to decide the ordering of the questions from this learning objective and decide when the learner has mastered this learning objective. So for example, if you have 7 questions within a learning objective, it's possible that one learner going through the assignment only needs to go through 2 or 3 of those questions to prove that they've mastered this learning objective. Another learner that's struggling with questions from this learning objective may have to go through 6 or 7 of those questions before they're able to move on. Or you could set a learning objective delivery style to be sequential, which basically means no matter what, OpenClass is going to draw those questions from your preset order and guarantee that all of those questions will be asked to the learner. And that's good for this walking through a loop example learning objective, because we want to show how iteration works in Python, where the learner going through this assignment could see, okay, this is what happens at iteration 0, this is what happens at iteration 1, this is what happens at iteration 2, and so on. And if you ever forget what these delivery style means, you can click this info modal, and there's a little description here of what the sequential delivery means and what the adaptive delivery means. And yeah, so basically how we have this assignment set is OpenClass will draw questions from list concepts and list indices first. Once the learner masters both of these learning objectives, they'll move on to this walking through a loop example, where they're going to go through all 4 of these questions, no matter if they get them correct or incorrect. It'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. And once they've gone through these questions, they'll lastly go to questions from this writing loops learning objective. And that's how review flows work in OpenClass. Learners that struggle with some learning objectives will be able to go through them at their own pace before moving on to questions that build upon that knowledge. Instructors now have a deep level of control in customizing the delivery of questions for their learners to optimize learning outcomes. You can play around with these review flows now at openclass.ai. Thank you for watching.